Good evening and welcome. If you're a little late, there are 3 front row seats, and that's about it. Welcome to the Toronto St. Paul's Candidates Forum. I'm Susanna Jacob. I will be moderator for the evening. I've lived here at Christie Gardens for almost 6 years, and I'm active in this community. We begin by expressing gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have lived on this land for millennia. In particular, we pay respect to the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River Nation, as we endeavor to live in harmony with them and to share in the care of this sacred land. I'm going to sit down, but I'm going to keep the microphone. Before the official meeting begins, I want to give some information, briefly, to Christie Gardens residents regarding voting at the election next Monday, October 21st. Voting is here in the auditorium from 9:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. next Monday. You do not need to come first thing in the morning when it's most crowded. When you come, bring your voting card and a piece of identification with your address on it. This can be your driver's license, a bill addressed to you, your Christie Gardens monthly invoice, anything with your name and address at Christie Gardens. If you did not receive your voting card, don't worry, we have you covered. Poll 422 is dedicated to Christie Gardens voters, but there will be other polls here for residents of the neighborhood, so it's likely to be very busy at times. There will be a team of resident volunteers, though, to help make the process as easy and efficient as possible. Tonight's meeting is co-sponsored by the Franco-Lambert Outreach Committee, FLOC, and the Christie Gardens Residents Association. FLOC includes residents from the 4 neighborhood housing cooperatives just west of Christie Gardens, as well as other members of the local community. Thanks to Christie Gardens for providing the space for this event. Three of the candidates were here last week at a panel sponsored by the Christie Gardens Ecology Group and answered many questions about their environmental and climate crisis plans. Tonight's format is somewhat different. Each of the candidates has been given a 30-minute time slot on their own. They'll each speak for 5 minutes, then answer questions. We will start with the same 3 prepared questions. In this way, we'll have consistency in questions and be able to consider each candidate's stance on 3 particular issues. Because time is limited, we're asking the candidates to limit their replies to 3 minutes for each of the prepared questions. After the prepared questions have been answered, I will ask for questions from the floor. If you want to ask a question, please prepare it as you are waiting and get directly to the question. This is not a time for giving your position. It's a time to ask the candidates their positions. Jeannie Dickey from the Franco-Lambert Outreach Committee will be timekeeper and will let the candidates know when they must come to the end of their replies. The first to speak will be Carolyn Bennett, Liberal candidate. Second will be Sarah Climenhaga, running for the Green Party. We will then have a 15-minute break. At 8:15, we will continue with Alok Mukherjee, NDP candidate, and we will conclude with J. Truesdell, PC candidate. Out of courtesy to all the candidates, please stay for the entire evening if you are able. If you have urgent questions for candidates, you may follow them as they leave, and they will respond as their schedules allow. Now, please welcome our first candidate, Carolyn Bennett, who will speak for 5 minutes.
thank you, Susanna and Jean, for what you'll keep us on track, and particularly thank you for the land acknowledgement. In that, I think that it's always amazing to be back here at Christie Gardens, where I think the Indigenous Interest Group has really led our riding on reconciliation, and we are very, very grateful as we try and remember that those diagonal roads of Vaughan and Davenport, and how we come to understand the importance of the rivers and our lake and the people who were here first. And I think, as we said last week, that if only we'd listened to Indigenous people about thinking 7 generations out, that we wouldn't be in this climate emergency right now. So I am humbly reapplying for my job as the MP for Toronto St. Paul's. I think that I'm very grateful for the format for tonight, because I think that at this time, usually debates are sort of earlier in the campaign, and that for us to be out knocking on doors and making phone calls, that our teams are out doing that. And so I'm very grateful, and thank you, Christie Gardens, for doing that. This is hugely important, and I have to say that this is every time very, very serious in terms of how seriously I take this job reapplication in this riding, where 50% of the citizens turn over between elections, and where there is a very core conservative base that gets up to 30% in almost every election. And so that this is not something I ever take for granted. This is a very, very important election, and it's very important to me that we get to move forward on the things that really, really matter. I'm also really worried that there is a serious campaign out there in terms of rising cynicism that decreases voter turnout, and that the progressive voters are quite often the ones who become increasingly cynical and choose to stay home, and that actually is what happened to Hillary Clinton in this last election, where people were made to feel very cynical about a progressive course, and they didn't vote for Trump, but they stayed home. And that is the case that I am worried about right here now. I'm proud to be part of, I think, one of the most progressive governments in the history of Canada. The fact that not only the plan, but the results have been things that the world is now looking towards. The fact that we are now viewed with our plan and with the kind of climate emergency plan that we've got, and the climate report card that puts the Liberal Party with the most feasible plan to get to net zero in 2050, that we have a plan that will actually do the job, and I'm happy, depending on the questions, to answer more later. It is about decreasing poverty, and decreasing poverty by 20%, decreasing child poverty by 1/3, by having 1.1 million new jobs and 300,000 in the clean tech sector. This is extraordinary in terms of how we have been able to actually move this country forward, and to be able to be proud that our unemployment rate is the lowest it's been since 1976, when it first was counted. So it is about affordable housing and affordability, and it is about our real serious plan to decrease chronic homelessness by 50%, but also to help young people be able to buy their first house. As we know, so many people in Toronto St. Paul's are worried that their children and grandchildren are thinking of moving out of town in order to start a family. We have got to have a serious plan, and I think the $55 billion in the serious plan of our national housing strategy is really organized to do everything that it will take to have people be able to have a safe, affordable place to call home. So it is about not taking anything for granted. It is about us looking back to the 10 years where the Conservatives were actually taking away everything we believed in. I remember meeting here with Ursula Franklin many times, where she felt that there was a big carpet where people were taking away the fibers around environment, around women's issues, around foreign aid, around housing, around the climate, on all of the things that really mattered. And so I'm just saying, I want to work with you to move forward to an even better Canada.
Thank you. Now, Carolyn has 3 minutes to answer each of 3 prepared questions. The first prepared question comes from Christie Gardens and is being asked by Marion Kirkwood. Marion?
It's on.
Now.
Yes, Canadians are long accustomed to the benefits of universal health care. We are now being asked to consider proposals for universal pharmacare. In this room tonight are seniors with ongoing medical needs, as well as younger citizens who are financially stretched by expenses. What are your party's plans for future health care in Canada? What will be included and not included? And how will you implement and pay for it?
Thanks very much. And I think as we moved into the kind of transfers to provinces, that it became very clear that they needed to know that there would be at least that 3% increase every year. But also, we knew that in order for it not to be cut back from hospitals or in terms of the various increasing costs, that there was a call from the provinces and territories to make additional costs, contributions to both home care and mental health. Those were the things that were viewed to be really lacking, and if you invest in those 2 things, then the cost to hospitals and the acute care system can diminish. On pharmacare, I think it is hugely important that we listen to Dr. Eric Hoskin's task force and we move forward in a way that's fair, coast to coast to coast. Obviously, the bulk buying, the rare diseases, those are the things that we've been able to start with. We need also to make sure that there are common formularies and for us to be able to move forward. And that coast to coast to coast, I was shocked to find that seniors in Atlantic Canada don't get a drug card unless they're actually getting GIS. We need to make this fair across the country. We've put a $6 billion down payment on that. We know it has to be more, but it is the fairest thing, and I think it's that Tommy Douglas wanted Medicare. I think at that time most people were admitted to hospital for their drugs. We've got to get with the times, and people should not, as the pharmacist told me 2 weeks ago, that $100 deductible here in Ontario now means that some people are leaving the pharmacy having not filled their prescriptions, and that can mean huge costs as they end up in the intensive care unit because they couldn't afford their puffers or their antibiotics. So this is completely straightforward. It's time. We're going to get it done.
Thank you. The second prepared question is from the Franco-Lambert community and is being asked by David Fielder.
Hello. The lack of affordable housing is a huge issue for our community, as it is across the country. Lack of regulation has resulted in the financialization of real estate, driving up the cost of rent at a rate far outpacing wages. What difference would your party's housing platform make to our community?
Thanks so much, and I think that probably when I was first elected, we were fighting to make sure that federally funded co-ops would actually have stable, predictable funding, and we have done that. And so I'm very proud that we've been able to do that. I think that in the National Housing Strategy, part of it is making sure that more affordable housing and rental housing is built, but also to be able to take the pressure off for people to be able to build their first or to buy their first home by using reducing their mortgage by 10% using CMHC. I think that those of us in the Toronto caucus were pretty vocal that what the original plan was wouldn't work here in Toronto, Vancouver, and Victoria, and we fought, and we can see in the platform that that's been changed to make the cost of a house that would qualify for the plan to be higher and closer to what would be a modest home here in Toronto. I think that one of the things we heard about the people on fixed incomes and the people really worrying about being able to stay in the place that they've been for a long time, and so beginning in the spring is budgeted a subsidy that will help people be able to pay for their rent or in order to be able to stay where they are. So this is a national housing strategy, $55 billion over 10 years, that's been built bottom up by listening to the housing activists and people like Adam Vaughan, who've been really out listening to make sure that every single kind of situation would be addressed in the strategy, and that we know we will keep listening and we will keep needing to do more.
Thank you. And the third question is from Christie Gordons and is asked by Walter Whiteley.
For over 30 years, the fossil fuel industries knew they were creating a climate crisis and dishonestly sold doubt about science to delay essential urgent actions. They promoted an unsustainable economy of business as usual and been selling us pipe dreams. Will you ensure that, so here's the two questions. Will you ensure that none of our Canada pension plan investments go to these culpable corporations? And the second is, how will you work across party lines to build a broad consensus for ambitiously decarbonizing our economy, and what package of aggressive carbon reducing policies will achieve these ambitions?
Thank you again, Walter. That was great, and I think we had a good conversation about some of these things last week. And I think that the reason that our climate plan checklist, that this compares us to the Conservatives in terms of, as you can tell, all the green checks are ours. But I think most recently to see the research by Andrew Leach and Catherine Hayhoe grade the major parties on their doable plan, that we were very pleased to see that the Liberal Party got a B on ambition and A on feasibility. The NDP got A on ambition and D on feasibility. The Green Party A plus on ambition, but C minus on feasibility, and the Conservative Party got D on ambition and F on feasibility. So, I think that these people are not partisans, they're academics, and I think that it is about how do we get to net zero in 2050, and it is doing all of the things that you here, Christie Gardens, have been fighting for in terms of the activism, putting a price on pollution, weaning ourselves off coal, banning single-use plastics. It is the investments in clean tech, and that we are now a leader and be able to protect more of the environment, plant 2 billion trees, be able to make it easier for people to be able to afford an electric vehicle, but also the retrofits that previously federal governments have not done for universities and hospitals. We will do that, as well as a $40,000 interest-free loan for homeowners to make the kind of energy efficiencies that they know they need, as opposed to only seeing it in a tax credit at the end of the year. We know people need that money to be able to make those changes right away, and that's what we heard as we go forward, as well as making sure that we have completely reduced the subsidies on fossil fuel by 2025.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions. Remember to get directly to the question so we can hear each candidate's, in this case, Carolyn's position. Kate Wiersma is going to come around with the mic. So raise your hand if you have a question.
Your government sort of came out with a lot of platitudes about Indigenous people, but there's been very little substantive action. Over a quarter of Indigenous people are still living in inadequate, overcrowded housing, and also they've actively opposed the implementation of the order of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to properly fund child and family services. Currently, child and family services for Indigenous people get much less money than that for the rest of the population.
Thanks for that, and certainly the money for family services has been equalized, and that is no longer an issue. The issue is how do we put in place the reforms that don't have the money going to lawyers to apprehend children, to agencies and to non-Indigenous foster families. How do we make sure that money goes to kids and families and communities to be able to make sure that child is raised as an Indigenous child, proud of who they are, and with that secure personal cultural identity. That's why we brought in Bill C-92 to make sure that no longer does Article 88 of the Indian Act apply and laws of general application, because the provinces and territories have not done a good job and agencies have been apprehending way too many children, and that we want to stop this, what we now call the millennial scoop. So we have invested $20 billion in improving the quality of life. It means we've got a plan that will lift all the boil water advisories by March of 2021. We've got the right money, we've got the plan, there's a website so everybody can track that. But the ultimate goal is self-determination and the recognition of Indigenous rights. And that means that I'm very proud of the work that we've done by having over half of the Indian Act bands now at the table as they are working on their laws and their governance to be able to work nation to nation. And that means that they will write their child well-being law. They will be in charge of health and education and infrastructure. And there is no question we have to do way more on the housing I think that in that decade of a conservative government, none of us could have known how terrible it was, and we just have to do more.
Carolyn, I wonder where you stand personally on the Trans Mountain expansion, and if you don't think it's a good idea, would you consider voting against it?
Thanks for that, and I know we've discussed this in this room before. We are in a transition period now, and that we in this big cold country still have to heat our homes and get long distances. It means that here on the railway, that the amount of fossil fuel traveling through our riding on the same route as Lac-Mégantic has tripled in the last 7 years. And it means that we've got to find a safe way to move it until we have put all of these measures in place so that we don't need it anymore. And that means that the decision was to twin an existing pipeline, not to build a new one, and it is a matter of making sure that First Nations all along the route are involved in the monitoring and the maintenance, and to make sure that it's as safe as it possibly be, which is still safer than rail or truck. It means that everything in the taxes for that pipeline will go into clean energy investments, and as it is sold, as we hope it will be sold to Indigenous organizations and companies, that money will go into clean tech. And I think that the people who understand that this is a transition that we want to be as short as it possibly can be, but it is a compromise I think we had to make, and I think that it is completely included in this plan that will get us to net zero by 2050, and it's what the experts know that we have counted that in the plan that we have presented.
Hi, Terry Lee, I live here. We heard your response to the question previously about the Indigenous children and their hardships, and the Human Rights Tribunal, in fact, has 3 times ruled that the government has not come along with this. It's not acting in behalf of how it's been ordered. So, why is your government appealing the decision? It's not as if you've accepted and gone along. You've actually appealed this.
So, in a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decisions, there is no way to ask for a delay. Even in an election, there's no process within the Human Rights Tribunal to ask for a delay. So the only option was to ask for a judicial review and to stay. The reason we need that is that the survivors themselves, the people who were harmed by the Child and Family Service, need a voice at the table. They cannot have the AFN or some organization determine on their behalf what would be fair. What I'm hearing from many of the survivors is that it is very different as it was with the TRC or the residential school settlement, or as we've done with the 60 Scoop. We have a tremendous track record of settling so many of these cases, but it has to be done fairly if it's going to unlock the healing. It means somebody who is in care for a week will certainly be acknowledged for that. But someone who was in care for a decade in 8 different homes, being abused each time, that needs to be a different kind of settlement. And as Chief Marsha Brown did with the 60 Scoop settlement, a lot of those people feel the money is one thing. What we want is access to healing, access to language and culture, as we set up in the 60 Scoop Foundation, as they did really as the survivors. So there was no way that by the December date we were going to have a system that all of the survivors would feel fair. And also, between 60 Scoop in 1991 and the Human Rights Tribunal in 2006, there's a whole generation of people who would not be helped by this. So we have to get it right so that we can unlock the healing. And on the original CHRT case, things like Jordan's Principle were only for a kid with multiple handicaps, on reserve, and with a squabble between the provinces and territory. With each decision, we have been able to do more. Now, just one handicap, maybe a mental health problem or a learning disability. On and off reserve and with no squabble. The federal government has stepped up. Under the Conservative government, 0 of those cases with Jordan's Principle were funded. Now it's 346,000 of those cases. These kids are getting what they need in a timely fashion. We have to do more, but I can pledge to you that this is something that worries me every single day. That this is about young people getting what they deserve, and being able to be proud of who they are and not apprehended from their families, and it just has to stop. And it's the reform that is going to be the most important thing, and that's why bringing in Bill C-92 will finally, the government will get out of the way so that we will fund it properly. But it'll be First Nations who will determine the well-being of their children as they have for millennia.
We have time for one more question, and if you haven't received answers to questions you have for Carolyn, you can meet her out in the auditorium if she has time to stay. But one more question now.
Thank you. It's really unacceptable that Canadian citizens are living in long-term boil water communities in 2019. Why did your government not target to eliminate this situation in the past 4 years and didn't do it, and I know you're continuing it on for another year or so to 2021, but why wasn't it done over the past 4 years altogether?
So I think this is a question that the engineers and the design people and the communities themselves would explain better than I can. In the past, water systems were funded for 2 years at a time. In the 2016 budget, we put in 5 years to make sure that there would be time for a feasibility study, design, and then the execution of the plan. Each community needs to be able to determine what kind of system they want and they need. Some are deciding to hook up to a local municipality. Some want the water out of the lake. Some want to drill wells. We have to make sure that that is all safe as they do with their choice of construction and engineers. So it is when we realized that there were other systems that maybe in the gas station or at the grocery store hadn't been included in our plan, we added those too. And now we have the website. We will be there, as we said we would be in 2021, in March of 2021. All of the long-term drinking water advisories will be lifted. But it is about really understanding that the difficult ones, Kitaganzibi with uranium in the water. These are not necessarily as easy as it looks, but we are going to work and get this done by 2021.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions, and thank you, Carolyn, for your time. And as I said, if you have questions for Carolyn that couldn't be addressed right here, she may have a little time to meet you out in the lobby there. So thank you very much for coming. So next, moving right along, is Sarah Climenhaga from the NDP, from the Green Party, sorry. Again, I can't read. Again, she has a 30-minute time slot. She'll speak for 5 minutes, have 3 minutes to respond to each of the prepared questions, and then we'll answer questions from the floor. So, please welcome Sarah.
Sarah, the microphone's in here.
Oh, I'm like, I don't know this kind of a microphone. That's because this is the microphone. It's so amazing to see such a good turnout, and I wish that this would happen every night in every different residents association, because we would have such a healthier democracy if everyone was as interested and engaged as you. So my name is Sarah Climenhaga. I am running for the Green Party. I've lived in St. Paul's almost my entire life. I grew up around Mount Pleasant and Davisville. I went to university at McGill in Montreal for 4 years and did my degree in biology and environmental studies. And then I moved back here and now raising 3 more St. Paul's residents at St. Clair Bathurst area. And I have, my mother-in-law is here at Christie Gardens, so and my father-in-law, my late father-in-law was here as well for many years, so I really love this building and the people in it, so it's nice to be here in this capacity. You know, I think about the Green Party, that obviously climate change and environmental protection are the basis for why we formed and why we're so passionate about running for government. Everyone laughed when Susanna said NDP, because I think, it's so radical to, like, you can't call one party by another party's name. And I think the Green Party, we're trying to get past that partisanship. We're just here to ask for the best possible platform. So I don't mind if it's the NDP, the Liberal, or Conservatives who puts forward the right platform. That's what's the most important, not whether it's the Green Party, the NDP, the Liberals, or the Conservatives. I ran for mayor last year because I thought in the city of Toronto we were not doing enough on housing, on transportation, on quality of life, and on environmental protection. And that's how I came across the Green Party. I felt it was unfair they were being excluded from some debates. So I showed up to some debate demonstrations, and then when they asked me if I would run this fall, and I said yes, because I knew I'd be voting for them, because there was the only platform that was strong enough on integrating the economy with the environment. And since I'd be voting for them, I felt comfortable to run for them. So that's why I'm here tonight. I don't know if I have anything else to say, because I think I'd rather hear all of your questions and address specifically what you're interested in asking me about. So I'm happy to move on to the question portion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. The first prepared question comes from Christie Gardens, asked by Don Nickel.
Sarah, Canadians are long accustomed to the benefits of universal health care. We're now being asked to consider proposals for universal pharmacare. In this room tonight are seniors with ongoing medical needs, as well as younger citizens who are financially stretched by expenses. What are your party's plans for future health care in Canada? What will be included, and what will not be included? And how will you implement and pay for it?
So, we, like the Liberals and the NDP, I believe, are supportive of universal pharmacare. We have that in our platform that all prescription medicines would be covered. But we would make sure that they are evidence-based. So they'd be subject to a rigorous process to make sure that the medicine that we're paying for is actually effective and does what it's supposed to do. And we would also be looking at how the government could use its, economic power to bulk purchase in a way that was cost-effective for Canada, because obviously it could be a very expensive policy, so we need to do it with scientific rigor and with, attention to the cost. We also, when it comes to healthcare, we're talking about covering dental care for low-income people. It would be great to offer it to everyone. Right now, we only see the budget for covering universal dental care for low-income people. But we recognize how crucial, dental care is for overall health. We also have mental health and support for a national dementia strategy in our platform as well, because mental health is increasingly important. Addiction is an increasingly important and expensive issue facing us, and as far as how would we pay for the healthcare promises that we're making, we consider the costs of poor healthcare, of insufficient coverage, of inattention to addiction and mental health as more expensive than covering these things. If people are not healthy, they end up in emergency rooms, which are extremely expensive. If people are not, their addiction and mental health is not taken care of, they end up in jails, which are far more expensive than proper mental health care. So we see it as an investment, and we do have, a costed platform where we look at different types of taxes and different type of revenue measurements we would use to pay for our whole platform. But we really see investing in universal services as an ultimate savings for the government, and certainly a savings for individuals as well.
Thank you. The second prepared question is from Franco-Lambert community, asked by David Fielder.
The lack of affordable housing is a huge issue for our community, as it is across the country. Lack of regulation has resulted in the financialization of real estate, driving up the cost of rent at a rate far outpacing wages. What difference would your party's housing platform make to our community?
Thank you for that question, and I think everyone in Toronto is very concerned about. The Green Party's platform is about, we have significant investment in building of housing. The federal government kind of hasn't been really that involved in building housing almost since the 1980s, is when we had our co-ops built and a lot of our good purpose-built rental housing. So the Green Party's intention is to both fund the housing that needs to be built, to fund the renovations of social housing that are desperately required and that are posing a real threat, because we are looking at a significant number of evictions due to poor quality social housing. So we're paying for building, renovation, and then looking at changing tax incentives to encourage private developers to build more housing as well, affordable, genuinely affordable housing. And that means affordable, a third of your income, not market rate or just below market rate, which is not affordable for many, many people. So I would say a combination of investment and tax changes. And we recognize housing is a basic human right. And again, how would we pay for it? Again, if people are not housed, they have far more problems that cost the government a lot of money. Jail, hospital, lack of being able to hold secure employment if you're always worried about a roof over your head. So we consider housing to be an investment in not just people, but our economy and society as well.
Thank you. And the third prepared question is from Christie Gardens and is asked by Walter Whiteley.
For over 30 years, the fossil fuel industry knew they were creating our climate crisis and dishonestly sold doubt about science to delay essential urgent action. They promoted an unsustainable economy of business as usual, endangering our future, essentially peddling pipe dreams. For two questions. One, will you ensure that none of our Canada pension plan investments go to these culpable corporations? And two, how will you work across party lines to build a broad consensus for ambitiously decarbonizing our economy, and what package of aggressive carbon-reducing policies would achieve these high ambitions?
Thank you for the question. I think you know the Green Party, again, the climate change and environmental protection has been the foundation of our party, so there's no compromise to us. The first thing we need to do is recognize that the Canadian government is paying to expand the climate change causing emissions. We're paying for pipelines, we're paying for fracking, we're paying for natural gas, we're paying credits for mining and logging companies. So if we want to stop hold climate change to a survivable level, we have to actually stop funding things first, and we can't do both. We wouldn't say, let's expand cigarette sales so we can make more revenue to pay for healthcare for lung cancer. I think everybody would recognize that's crazy, but that's what we're talking about doing. We'll use the taxes from oil development to pay for climate change mitigation. So the first thing we have to do, and this is where we would try, working with other parties, is to just continue saying we cannot keep going with business as usual. Our economy has to be something that is going to nurture and enhance our environment, not degrade it. So to work with all the parties, I think, first of all, we need to be nonpartisan. We need to make sure it's not about Greens versus NDP or versus Liberals or versus Conservatives. We're all human beings. The climate impacts all of us, whether we have clean air or clean water. It impacts all of us. We might have different ideas on what the best way to address the problems we're having, but as long as we're listening to science, we're going to be, and we go for innovation, we'll be okay. So the Green Party would just keep saying, don't listen to us, let's listen to the scientists, let's listen to the international consensus. We've all heard it, now what's our steps forward? We do have in our platform that we would have a multi-party kind of war room dealing with this as the emergency that it is. So that's one of the ways we would encourage working between parties. And then what are the aggressive steps we would take? Well, stopping the subsidies is number one. Investing in wind, in solar, in energy conservation, in retrofitting buildings so that they have a net draw of zero, in converting, say, oil wells to geothermal, or to look at other ways where we can change from an oil or a gas economy to one that's based on renewable, that's based on conservation. We also have targets on, public transit and making streets safer for people who are walking, people who are in wheelchairs, people who are cycling. There are so many things we could do with our economy so that we would be addressing the threats that climate change is posing, but so that we would also be improving quality of life for all of us in the short term. It's not just about the emergencies in the long term. It's about making our lives better today. The more we invest in trees and parks, the more we invest in clean water, the less we pollute our air. That benefits us all today. So those are the things we'd like to do.
Thank you. You came in just under the wire. So the floor is now open for questions, and we really appreciated that people got right to the questions in the first segment. And so if you have a question for Sarah, please raise your hand and Kate will come to you.
If you form part of a government by supporting another party, would you put forward, make a significant demand for an end to first past the post politics in some form of representation by population?
Yeah, electoral reform is a key tenet of the Green Party, and it's the way we think we can get much better policy. It's not just about getting seats for whatever party, it's about getting better policy and encouraging cooperation between parties and instead of the hyper-partisan competition that we have right now. So yes, electoral reform is a key, is something we would not compromise on. We need it, and I'm not going to speak about what would we do in this coalition or that coalition. I will just say that we absolutely insist on electoral reform. It's a basic principle of the Green Party, and we think it's a principle of democracy. We need it. So yes, anyone that wants to work with us, we look forward to working with them on electoral reform.
like to know what you would do to improve the city of Toronto. Would you, for example, try to solve the traffic problem, the snarled traffic, the over-construction of new apartments so high, 50, 60 stories? There's a lot of congestion, there's a lot of noise, but there aren't parks and there's not enough schools in the right neighborhoods. I know that Josh Matlow works for this, and I wonder how much the city could do to, if you had been elected, for example, what changes would you have made?
Well, I guess I'll speak more to the federal government's role in how Toronto functions, and like housing, a big lack of, the reason we have so little progress on housing is partially through action of the different levels of government, but it's partially the lack of dollars invested by the federal government. So that's one thing we would do to try and help Toronto with its housing crisis, is actually invest dollars in building housing, in renovating existing housing, in working on energy efficient housing as well. When it comes to transportation and traffic, I mean, the reason that people are in their cars is because it's slow, it's too slow, it's too difficult. Some people find it's too expensive, although driving, you know, is more expensive than transit. But for some people, the $3.25 that you pay right away compared to the free 10-minute drive feels free, it is a factor. So to encourage people to get out of their cars, we have to have public transit that is competitive for them within the city of Toronto. And we have to do that by paying for operations, by paying for enough bus fleet, by making sure, you know, subways are able to be built in the areas where they have high demand. So again, that comes from federal dollars. It also comes from investing in rail, investing in bus between cities. You know, once we have good, solid transit, people will use that transit, and that's the only thing that's going to take care of the gridlock, as well as making sure our streets are walkable, are safe for those who have limited mobility or who are in a wheelchair, safe for those who want to ride bicycles. There's this perception that everybody wants to drive, but there's a certain percentage of people who, yes, absolutely want to drive no matter what. But there is also a large percentage of people who drive just because it's the only option that works for them, that would be happy to take other modes of transportation. So gridlock is a problem of planning and of resources and of priorities. So the federal government could take a role in all of those things. And could work more closely with the city of Toronto. The city has had some problems with the province sometimes not agreeing with their priorities. And the federal government can definitely have a closer relationship with cities to be more responsive to what it is that they need.
What would you do to ensure that Indigenous nations have clean drinking water?
I think it's a matter of political will, and it's a matter of money. So if it's a priority and we are willing to go through with it, then there's no reason, you know, if this building suddenly didn't have clean water, you all raise your voice. You all have a good relationship with your local MP, and you're all voters, and no one would let you go with a boil water advisory for 6 months. These other communities are marginalized and they don't have a strong voice, and so it's just left as a lower priority. So all I can say is the vision and the will of the Green Party is not to have these kinds of differences between higher income and lower income communities or more vulnerable communities. We do have a very specific platform that I haven't memorized that I would welcome anyone to take a look at, greenparty.ca. It's an 88-page platform, and there are very specific recommendations with regards to reconciliation, with regards to the clean water, boiled water advisories, with regards to any policy issue. So I invite you to take a look at that and see the specifics of what we're saying. But I can say we don't think it's acceptable. We're committed to investing the money, and we're committed to working with the communities to get rid of that unacceptable situation.
Can you tell me what the Green Party position is?
Hold the mic like an ice cream
Sorry.
cone.
What would the Green Party position be on the federal government regulating and banning in Canada the sale and possession of assault weapons and handguns?
You know, I've read over our criminal justice policies, and I'm not sure how specific we are. Certainly in municipal, like in big cities, there's no need for any kind of weapons like that, a handgun. So I believe in our platform we are pretty unequivocal about that. I think that, you know, we do recognize in rural communities there is some hunting, and so there would be some kind of, I don't know what our position would be in those kinds of weapons. But certainly in cities, there's no place for those kinds of weapons. We would be opposed to it, and we would want to work with the city on legislation to help the city with that. You know, with regards to crime, the Green Party very much feels as if we look at the evidence that shows that crime, whether it's gun violence, whether it's gang violence, whether it's violence by knife or domestic assault, it often comes from, you know, an economic inequality. It comes from people struggling without housing, without mental health supports, without addiction supports, without, you know, proper mobility in the city. So we really want to attack the root causes of crime as well as the symptoms, like the gun violence that we see. And we also would have, you know, at customs, there's so much attention to who the kind of racist or, you know, fear of the other that is being screened for at customs instead of weapons. I mean, there is a real problem with weapons coming from the United States. We would emphasize that the border should be looking at weapons to stop the flow of weapons into Canada. And we would also have an amnesty to try and, you know, have an anonymous amnesty so people could give back their guns and take them out of circulation.
Good evening. Our planet, all of our planet, is in crisis. To talk about reducing Canadian aid at this time in history is destructive and unethical. Remember the damage done to others' lands and waters overseas by our Canadian mining companies. We need to increase our official development to 0.7%, having been promised for 25 or more years, up from our miserly 0.26%, even when most of this money is spent in Canada. Will you and your party commit to increasing Canada's official development assistance to 0.7% of our gross national income as per the international guidelines?
We definitely have in our platform increasing foreign aid to, you know, the levels that it should be. And if it's 0.7, I'm sorry, I can't remember. I can certainly say I would advocate that we meet the standards that we should be meeting. And again, if we invest in other countries, we help, you know, if we're helping the globe, it's an investment, it's not a subsidy. And if we're not spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on oil and gas in our own country, that frees up funds to spend on all sorts of other things, including international assistance. So we are definitely committed to helping countries who are suffering, particularly from the effects of climate change, which Canadians contribute to a disproportionate amount due to the amount of energy and resources that we use.
If you are fortunate enough to get a spot in the federal cabinet in the next government, what cabinet role do you think best suits you and why?
You know, my environment is in, my background is in environment and transportation, so anything that had those, you know, to do with, I would love to be involved with that. My feeling is that all the cabinets that we have right now need to be completely reintegrated with the environment. We have the Ministry of the Environment as if that's something separate that we can take care of with whatever money we have left over and time. But all of the ministries that we have need to be done. The business needs to be looked at with a view to what is going to benefit our people and what is going to benefit our health, the planet of our health. So and the other thing is, I feel like the ministers, cabinet ministers, the roles, we politicians have to recognize that a lot of the expertise lies outside of our background. So I think that whatever ministry that I would be fortunate enough to be in charge of, I think I would be relying on the expertise of the people who really know those topics. And I think that's what politicians need to be doing, is making decisions based on vision of what we want, but the specifics of it need to be based on the expertise of those who have been trained in all of those areas. But I will answer your question in one slightly different way, because as everyone chuckled, because it seems like it's probably not that likely that I would be elected and then how the Greens would be enough power to appoint people to the different ministries. What I'm asking for our people is to vote Green if you find you agree with our platform. The reason I want you to vote Green is not to send me is not to elect me as your MP, because looking at the polls, honestly, it's pretty likely that Carolyn Bennett will be re-elected. I'm just speaking frankly because I want to tell you why I'm running, and it's because we need the Green platform. We need the platform on climate change to be passed. And every vote for the Green Party, if you agree with our platform, sends the message. It's using your voice to tell the government that does get elected what you want. And hey, maybe if everyone does it, you will elect me. But the point of your vote is to raise your voice for what you want. And so I get diverted at the door a lot about strategic voting or do you have a chance or whatever. That's not why I'm running. If I'm running and I get elected, that's fantastic. But I'm running because I believe so much that we need to take action, and that this government is still not taking action. They still think Canadians aren't ready for it. And so a vote for the Greens, if you agree with us, it sends the message that that's what you think too. And they will listen to that. We have 2 Green MPs in Canada right now. It's making a difference on policy. So, when they see 10% votes Greens, 15% vote Green, 25% vote Green, even with a broken electoral system, it still sends a big message, and it still will affect change in government. So, thanks for the questions. I can say that so far.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to go out on some applause. This ends the first half of our evening. We're taking a 15-minute break so you can stretch your legs and arms and have a chat with your neighbor. Please don't go away. Please stay for our other 2 candidates who will be here after the break. So we'll see you back at 8:15. There are some seats here and there that will be available, so find yourself somewhere comfortable to sit. And thank you for staying for the second half of the evening. We recognize it's a long evening, but we're dealing with important issues.
Get onto the right stage. That's the new person that's being tomorrow. Okay.
So for the second half of the evening, the format is the same as it was for the first half of the evening, that each of the candidates has 5 minutes to speak, and then there are 3 prepared questions, the identical questions for all the candidates, and each candidate has 3 minutes to answer each of those 3 questions. And then questioning will be open to the floor, and it has been really gratifying that people have gotten right to their questions and not given long political speeches of their own. If they want to do that, they can run next time. Our next candidate is Alok Mukherjee, who is from the NDP. And he will be speaking for 5 minutes, so please welcome Alok.
Is this the mic?
You can hold it, you can hand hold it.
Oh, that. I can use this one? Yeah.
Or that you're holding it in your hand, that's fine.
Let's see what works.
Do you want to hold it, or do you?
I'll hold it.
Yeah.
I just need some technical aid to make up for my soft voice. Well, first of all, good evening, all of you. It's wonderful to be back here and to have the opportunity to answer your questions on behalf of the NDP and to tell you a little bit about my own reason for plunging into this election, which I've never done before. Avoided running in elections all my life. I do want to thank the organizers for putting this together and giving us an opportunity to share our vision, the reason why the issues that we are, as different parties, advocating for, and to answer questions. Let me just say that I have lived in this neighborhood. I used to live on Marchmount. In this neighborhood for 35 years, between Marchmount and where we live now, on Pinewood. And between 2005 and 2015, I did something which was totally unexpected, and that was to serve as the chair of the Toronto Police Services Board. I didn't realize that I was the second longest serving chair, except that when in 2004 the City Council appointed me, Joe Mukherjee used to be the chair of the nominating committee. He called me at night and he said, "You are either crazy or hopelessly idealistic. Why would you want to take this on?" Well, it turned out to be a decade-long engagement in trying to bring some change in police, make police more accountable, deal with some of the issues related to policing that were of serious concern to the community, and particularly the racialized members of the community, the indigenous members of the community. So it was a challenge, and as I think back to it, I feel that maybe it is a similar touch of combination of madness and hopeless idealism that persuaded me to run in the election this time. I decided to run, this was furthest from my mind, until July the 7th. I finished working at Ryerson after my stint at the police board as a distinguished visiting professor. I finished that on June 30th, and we went on a bit of a family holiday. Landed back here on July 7th and found an email from some friends in the neighborhood saying, "Don't laugh when you read this." And they said I should run for this election. Cut the long story short, I was convinced that this was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do because there were issues at the federal level that were of great concern to me. And I felt that the hope that was generated 4 years ago of some important things happening had been left unfinished. Hopes around doing justice or doing the right thing by Canada's Indigenous peoples. Hope that we will finally, after years of neglect, take serious action to deal with climate crisis. hope that the whole crisis around affordable housing will receive the attention that it deserves. Hope that we will make accessible health care, reduce cost of pharmacare, that those will be realized. So on and on the list goes. And I felt that the window for dealing with these significant issues about our present and our future and the future of our generations to come were being put at risk by the kind of slow pace with which those were being addressed. I would say they were not being addressed, but not with the seriousness and with the urgency and with the speed that is necessary. And so it was my expectation that if, as NDP, we can do better and send to Ottawa a good group of progressive people with a progressive platform, we can hasten the pace of change that needs to happen now. So I decided that I could perhaps play a role in that push for change, for speeding up the process of change that we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alok. Now we will come to our 3 prepared questions, and you will have 3 minutes to respond to each of them. The first prepared question comes from Christie Gardens, asked by Marion Kirkwood.
Canadians are long accustomed to the benefits of universal health care. We are now being asked to consider proposals for universal pharmacare. In this room tonight are seniors with ongoing medical needs, as well as younger citizens who are financially stretched by expenses. What are your party's plans for future health care in Canada? What will be included and not included, and how will you implement and pay for it?
That question has a lot of personal resonance for me. Yes, we have been blessed with a public healthcare system, but we can do a whole lot better with it. The NDP is proposing to push for universal comprehensive healthcare, for universal comprehensive dental care, and a pharmacare plan that reduces the cost of drugs that we right now pay. I met recently in a forum for senior citizens, people who haven't had the ability to get dental care for 20, 30 years. They're wearing dentures that are 20 years old. That ought not to be in our country. I know from my own problems with vision, I need medication. I could buy them for 3 months for $50 in India. Here I pay $50 for 2 of those for 1 month. That is ridiculous. So NDP is talking about universal comprehensive. It will be expensive. But our feeling is that there are untapped sources of revenue. One of those is the billions of dollars that are sitting in offshore accounts on which taxes are being avoided to be paid. And I learned that even our finance minister and the head of the Treasury Board have those accounts. So NDP is talking about creating an enforcement task force to go after those unpaid taxes, and the estimate is that that can generate $20 billion a year in income that Canada, that we as people have paid on. So that's just one source of significant funds that can be used to do better for all the ordinary people like ourselves. That is right now being used up to the advantage of the very affluent of the society.
Thank you. The second prepared question is from the Franco-Lambert community, asked by Tamara Esty.
Hi. The lack of affordable housing is a huge issue for our community, as it is across the country. The lack of regularization has resulted in the financialization of real estate, driving up the cost of rent at a rate far outpacing wages. What difference would your party's housing platform make to our community?
It is a crisis, the access or the unavailability of affordable housing. Yesterday I was canvassing with a young professor from University of Toronto, and she said, look, I have a good income, and I have good liquid cash to pay the monthly mortgage, but I cannot come up with $200,000 to make the down payment. So I'm better off living in rental. I met a person the other day, single parent with 3 teenage children. She pays $2,000 a month for a small apartment for the 4 of them, and it is 80% of her income. So when I say it's a shame, it is a shame. NDP is talking about investment in affordable social housing and has a target of building 500,000 homes in the social housing sector over 10 years. NDP is also talking about providing rental support to people who live in rented accommodation up to $5,000 a year to cushion the burden that they carry. NDP is saying that it is prepared to give GST, HST exemption to developers so that they build affordable housing. So those are just 3 of the ways in which NDP is talking about addressing the issue of affordable housing, affordable social housing.
Thank you. And the third prepared question is from Christie Gardens and is asked by Walter Whiteley.
For over 30 years, the fossil fuel industries knew they were creating our climate crisis and dishonestly sowed doubt about science to delay essential urgent action. They have promoted an unsustainable economy of business as usual, endangering our shared future, essentially peddling pipe dreams. And if people are curious, look up the origin of pipe dreams. Will you ensure that none of our Canada Pension Plan assets go to these culpable corporations? And how will you work across party lines to build a broad consensus for ambitiously decarbonizing our economy, and what package of aggressive carbon reducing policies can achieve these high ambitions?
Thank you. I hadn't thought about that explanation of the origin of pipe dream, but it works. It's not only science. Just recently, a few days ago, Mark Carney, who is now the Governor of Bank of England and used to be the Governor of Bank of Canada, gave a very significant speech in which he said that the corporations who continue to rely on fossil fuel will go bankrupt. This is from the Governor of Bank of England. And he also identified pension funds as one of the biggest investors in fossil fuel industry, who need to rethink their investment strategy. So NDP is talking about as making a commitment to ending the billions of dollars in subsidy that is provided to the fossil fuel sector right now, and investing instead in renewable green energy. As far as the pension funds are concerned, technically they are arm's length, and some of them have made odd statements about their fiduciary responsibility to their contributors. But the government is one of the major stakeholders in government related public sector pension funds. And if I were to be in a position to have any influence, dealing with pension funds and their strategies of investment so that they are ethical, they are in the interest of environment, they do not continue to endanger the future of this planet, would certainly be something that I personally would want to advocate for, even though it may not be explicitly stated in the platform of the NDP right now. I would think that the commitment that the NDP is making to dealing with or to stopping support for fossil fuel industry creates a window of opportunity to broaden that conversation and look at all the public sector related sources from which fossil fuel industry draws support and how to use government's authority and government's obligation to deal with them. That is how I would answer your questions.
Thank you. And now we move on to the questions from the floor. And if you have a question, raise your hand. Kate will bring you the microphone.
Yes, I'm not sure that this is exactly the best forum in which to ask this question, which probably is more relevant to a younger audience, but I will ask it in any case. In many urban centers, drug addiction is a social and health issue that has in some places been addressed by strategies of harm reduction. We lived in Vancouver for a long time, for instance. I am interested in knowing the NDP position on harm reduction strategies, which have been tremendously eroded by some provincial governments in this country. And I think that it's possibly an issue for a national health policy, but I'm not sure about that, and I don't know what your government or what the NDP would say to that.
As the chair of the police board, that was definitely an issue that was very much part of our work and our concern, and where policing resources went in a significant way. And from my experience, enforcement and criminalization will not deal with the drug problem. There are places where that becomes necessary, but harm reduction, looking at the whole question of a more progressive, enlightened drug policy are things that we need to pay attention to. Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, has talked about legalization with harm reduction and support for those who find themselves addicted to or consumption of drugs. So prevention, support, as opposed to criminalization. That is very much in the framework of NDP's commitment. You just reminded me of something I read about Portugal, and where they legalized all drugs. And what they found was that the actual percentage of drug users is a very minute proportion of the population. And it makes more economic and social policy sense to provide the care, the support that they need. The healthcare dollars spent on that is much less than the enforcement model that we use in North America. So, okay.
If you end up propping up a government of another party, or with another party propping up their government, will you put forward, first past the post, the promise that was made by Trudeau before that this would be the last first past the post election?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm aware that many people, including myself, were very excited and felt hopeful when in the last election campaign Mr. Trudeau made that commitment that that would be the last election in the current first past the post system. And I've heard it said by our Liberal friends that the government did not move forward because there was no consensus. But we do know that the House of Commons Standing Committee did come up with a unanimous report, which the Prime Minister chose to disregard and out of the blue claim that there was no appetite for change in the country. Well, as I knock on doors, I find that that issue is very much alive and well. People want a change in the electoral system. They realize the limitations of this system, and NDP definitely wants to see and wants to fight for the end of first past the post system. Quite frankly, it's a system that works to the advantage of the two parties who have played musical chairs with government.
Yes, Mr. Mukherjee, could you tell us if the NDP has a timetable that is different from the Liberal timetable of getting us to a carbon neutral position as a country? I think that timetable is 2050. Can we do better than that?
NDP certainly thinks we can do better than that. I just mentioned, when the Prime Minister, when the current government talks about a 2050 timetable, it's by using a rather low bar and rather unambitious interventions. NDP is talking about accelerating the pace of change. Not only ending subsidies to fossil fuel industry, yes, also investment in renewable, investment in transition to a green economy, investment in cleaner energy, looking at the farm sector, because when we talk about greenhouse gases, there is a significant proportion of greenhouse gases that are a result of the feed that is given to farm cattle. And there is scientific evidence from our own scientists in Canada, Sherbrooke, that shows that 30% of the greenhouse gas emitted by farm animals can be reduced simply by changing the feed that is given to them. So NDP is looking at a range of interventions that can be used sooner rather than later to meet an earlier target.
Mr. Mukherjee, you and Bill Blair from the Liberal Party both were involved with the Toronto Police Services Board during the period of carding, when there was a big issue, and it still remains to be an issue today, but looking at policies, how to address carding, how to identify it, and how to stop it. Considering that the Liberal Party has Mr. Blair and the NDP Party has you, the question that I have is one that impacts all of Canada, because carding is a national issue. It is a question for this federal election. And what is your party doing to start carding across Canada to ensure police accountability and to create a national database where people can research the number of police officers involved in serious crimes or egregious acts against citizens, that something can be done. How is your party holding police accountable nationally?
What is carding?
That's what I want to know.
Okay. Carding is a police practice. When police randomly stop people, mostly young people, racialized young people, and indigenous young people, and poor homeless young people. When they stop them randomly and question them, the practice has been that the police take down their personal information, put them in a form that used to be called a card, contact card, and then transfer that information into the police database. And communities, in Black and Indigenous communities in Toronto, for example, Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario and elsewhere, they have been protesting against that practice because it criminalizes, it puts into the police database information about young people who were not engaged in any criminal activity and were not the subjects of any criminal investigation. They happened to be by the street corner, congregating together. They happened to be in some neighborhood where, in the police's subjective opinion, they had no business being, and they would be stopped. So it's a random process. In Ontario, and John, you know this, we fought together. Finally, the previous Liberal government, Kathleen Wynne's government, brought in a regulation to regulate this practice across the province. But that has not happened everywhere in the country, whether it is British Columbia or Quebec or Atlantic provinces, Nova Scotia. The practice still prevails in one form or another. And the fear is that that database is being then used inappropriately when there is a crime. Police go into that database to pull out names of people who may be living in the area where the crime was committed and target them for investigation, when in the first place their names ought not to have been there, because there was no criminal reason for it. So your question is a very important question for me and for the NDP. NDP is a very strong proponent of upholding human rights and charter rights of people. It is a strong proponent of anti-racism strategies. And one of the key components of a comprehensive anti-racism strategy has to be to prevent a practice that criminalizes innocent people when there was no basis to do that. As you know, policing is a provincial jurisdiction, except for the policing that is provided by RCMP through contract policing in communities in British Columbia and Atlantic provinces and so on. So there's two things that can be done. This is a quick answer. One, the federal government can use its oversight of RCMP to ban, prohibit this baseless, subjective practice. Two, the NDP can push the federal government to convene a federal, provincial, territorial, municipal table, which by the way exists. The public safety minister chairs such a table, where all the solicitors general and ministers of community safety of Canada sit together with the federal minister, where they develop some common strategies, common programs, and so on. So although municipal policing is outside of the jurisdiction of federal government, there is no reason why the federal government cannot be pushed to be proactive as part of a comprehensive anti-racism strategy to convene such a table and develop a common strategy across the country. And if I'm there, I would push for that, fight for that.
Thank you, and actually that is our time. Sorry to cut you off. Thank you, Alok, for coming. Thank you for good questions, and that ends Alok's time. He will be heading out. If you have further questions for him, you can meet him outside.
So if I have 10 seconds, my campaign manager gave me a line. He said, I have a great line for you. I heard him say, I have a great wine for you. But I have to share this line with you. He said, I've been married to Arun, my partner, for 51 years. So I know a little bit about what commitment is all about. So the things we have talked about require commitment. And Rory, my campaign manager, wanted me to assure you that you have that commitment from me. Thank you very much.
So, we come to the fourth and final candidate for MP for our riding. Thank you. So the fourth candidate is Jay Truesdell from the Progressive Conservative Party, and he'll speak for 5 minutes and then hear the 3 prepared questions and give 3-minute answers to each of them. So, welcome Jay, and you have your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you to Christie Gardens for hosting such a great event. I'll start off by telling you a bit about myself and my background, and then I'd be very happy to answer any of your questions. I grew up in Chelsea, Quebec, close to Ottawa, down the street from Governor General Ray Titian, who, if you remember, was the first Governor General in recent memory to open the residence to the public. And because of that, he refused to live there. So I would bike down the road and be gently greeted by his RCMP security and asked to stop. If I woke up early enough in the morning, I could see his convoy of security cars and limousine drive up the street. And I think that's what initially sparked my interest in politics, seeing, gated things that are far off and realizing as I grew older that they're actually pretty close to you. Growing up in Chelsea was an interesting place. We were surrounded by politics, though it wasn't at the forefront of our conversations at dinner. I went to school in Ottawa, ultimately, to the same high school as Andrew Scheer, though a few years later. I didn't take a direct route to school following high school, though eventually studied at Harvard Business School with my wife, studying climate change economics and governance at the London School of Economics. It took me a while to get there. I started off selling real estate, country homes and cottages throughout Western Quebec. I then moved to Montreal and worked for Colliers Macaulay Nichols in both Montreal and Ottawa, seeing the differences in markets in Quebec versus markets in Ontario. That led me to join a group of young guys in Toronto who were leaving Brookfield Financial and starting to develop wind and solar powered projects across Ontario. So I had the opportunity to move to Toronto. My first office was at 2345 Yonge Street, which was very easy for a kid from Ottawa to remember. I was lucky to live in Forest Hill when I first moved here, which was a nice, easy transition into the busy city that Toronto is. My campaign office also happens to be just below where my second apartment was in the city. So I feel like I've come full circle in about 15 years. Working in Southern Ontario and working in green energy, as you can imagine, was polarizing. It was a very well-conceived, well-intentioned policy that was developed centrally in Toronto for the betterment of Ontario. But most of the implementation was in rural Ontario. It was primarily conservative and had a lot of opposition. So living in Grand Bend for a year, we had a beautiful summer and a not as beautiful winter. We had a few pop tires and only one shotgun pulled on us over the course of the year. But we're able to work with those that were interested in the technology and in the income stream to develop some pretty fantastic wind arrays in Southern Ontario. But it really taught me how very well-conceived, well-intentioned policies can have unfortunate and unforeseen effects on the communities where they're implemented. When I left the green energy sector, I didn't go too far. I joined the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, which is a multi-municipal regional organization that's made up of the City of Toronto, parts of Peel, parts of York, and parts of Durham. So they have a board of 32 members, some of which are city councillors, mayors, and citizen appointees. And it was very interesting to understand how all of these different communities from across the Greater Toronto Area really came together for the betterment of their environment with all of their diverse needs and wants. While I was at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, I was their Senior Manager of Property and Legal Services. The TRCA owns about 40,000 acres throughout the Greater Toronto Area. They're one of the largest, if not the largest, landowner. We were able to unlock some of those lands for affordable housing for community projects. We were able to work very closely with our municipal partners in the City of Toronto to ensure that there was community access to the lands and that different community projects could be built on the lands. While I was at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, I'll admit I did not have a clear understanding of climate change and its impacts. So I went to the London School of Economics for a summer course in climate change economics and governance. It's one of the key reasons why I'm running. And while I would probably tend to agree with a lot of people that none of the plans go far enough, I think that our plan to tackle large emitters, require industry to invest in green technology is the best start. And I think it focuses on the most important things that have the largest impact on people. Following the TRCA, I had the opportunity to join the province.
Your 5 minutes is up.
That's time. I write a housing bill and we can talk about that later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're on to the prepared questions. Jay's been sitting and listening and learning tonight, so he knows what the questions are. They'll be asked, and he will answer them. He has 3 minutes for each one.
Curveballs are welcome.
The first prepared question comes from Christie Gardens, asked by Don Nickel.
Jay, Canadians are long accustomed to the benefits of universal health care. We are now being asked to consider proposals for universal pharmacare. In this room tonight are seniors with ongoing medical needs, as well as younger citizens who are financially stretched by expenses. What are your party's plans for future health care in Canada? What will be included? And what will not be included? And how will you implement and pay for it?
So if you're familiar with our platform, you'll understand that we have committed to increasing healthcare funding annually by a minimum of 3%. To help provinces escape from an annualized budgeting process, I think it is important for healthcare and any other social infrastructure to ensure that provinces know in the long term how much money they're receiving and how they can expand and enhance their services. When it comes to universal pharmacare, My understanding is that we're at close to 98% access to coverage, and I think it is best left in the hands of the provinces. I think what we've seen provincially in Ontario is an announcement around seniors' dental care for seniors under a certain income threshold having access to free dental care, which I think is admirable. But I think the best thing that the federal government can do on the healthcare front is guarantee minimum increases in funding, help to prioritize where that funding goes, and redirect some excess spending in other areas back to spending that actually helps Canadians and helps them live a happy and healthy life.
Thank you. The second question has been prepared by the Franco-Lambert community and is being asked by Tamara Esting.
Good evening. The lack of affordable housing is a huge issue for our community, as it is across Canada. Lack of regularization has resulted in the financialization of real estate, driving up the cost of rent at a rate far outpacing wages. What differences would your party's housing platform make to our community? And we'd like to ensure that our community is ethnically diverse and that people of all walks of life can live together.
So before I wasn't able to finish, I was going to mention that I spent the last year in the province of Ontario writing a housing bill. And it was primarily directed at removing barriers for community facilities like this, removing municipal fees and timelines for not-for-profit and long-term care. But what I really see as the largest problem in our housing shortage is that it is really just a housing shortage. There are 100,000 people coming to the City of Toronto every single year, and we're building on average 30,000 new units. We do not have enough space for people that are coming in. When it comes to what the federal government can do, I do not believe that giving you 10% down payment for your mortgage and holding an equity interest in your first home is an appropriate way to help people get into the housing market. I think it helps to increase prices. But where I do think the federal government can be massively helpful is in access to mortgages and is also in use of land. So I mentioned before the Toronto Region Conservation Authority on its own holds 40,000 acres of land. Now there's a very small percentage of that that could or should be developed. But when you add in the municipal government, the provincial government, and the federal government, there is a lot of land available and capital available to help in the development of affordable housing. There's the Thistletown complex up at Finch, which has, I think, capacity for 15,000 units. The government should be there in a way that uses your money as best as possible. In my belief, that's your capital, the assets we already own, and not your operating, the taxes that you're paying every year. So I really do think that with the right provincial, federal, and municipal cooperation, that we can use the assets we already have to help spur affordable housing and build more than we have right now. What I've seen provincially is $1 billion budget geared toward housing, wherein less than 20% actually goes toward building more housing. That I think is inverted. I think we should be spending 80% of our budget on building the housing and 20% of our budget on managing it.
Thank you. And the third prepared question comes from Christie Gardens and is asked by Walter Whiteley.
So you've been listening to the questions, so you hopefully can give answers to both parts. For over 30 years, fossil fuel industries knew they were creating our climate crisis and dishonestly sold doubt about science to delay essential, urgent action. They have been promoting an unsustainable economy of business as usual, endangering our shared future, essentially peddling pipe dreams. Will you ensure that none of the Canada Pension Plan assets that we've contributed go to these culpable corporations? And two, how would you work across party lines to build a broad consensus for ambitiously decarbonizing our economy? And what package of aggressive carbon-reducing policies will achieve higher ambitions?
Sure, so I'll address the first part. I think that as a rule, political interference in pension fund management is not something that I would be for. I trust our pension fund managers and the different funds that they invest in to invest in a way that is ethical, is competent, and I think that the slippery slope of politicizing what and how we invest is a little dangerous to your retirement and mine. When it comes to decarbonizing our economy, I believe that we need a strong economy that can transition. I am not of the belief that we are able to transition in the next 10 years. I think that we need to be realistic about how we transition our economy from a fossil fuel and resource-based economy to a green economy. And I think that is not by going after people to change their car to an electric or to get out of their pickup truck. I think it is about going after the people that create the system that requires you to have a pickup truck and to have a car. I think we need better investments and longer-term investments in public transit. I think we need to stop funding public transit line by line and station by station. We need to have a 20-year or a 30-year view of the transit we need. When we finish the Eglinton Crosstown, we will still be 20 years behind our actual needs. But I think that working with large industries, working with large polluters, working with things like deforestation that account for over 20% of emissions, working with industries like goods transportation, which also account for over 20% of emissions, gets us a lot further than working with passenger vehicles that account for less than 10% of overall emissions.
Thank you. Am I still on? Yes. Thank you, and now we move to the open questions. So anyone on the floor who has a question, raise your hand.
Mr. Truesdell, is that correct? The indoctrination of white supremacy is at the history and foundation of Canada. It impacts environmental racism, where Indigenous lands are sold off to mining companies and oil companies and corporations. It leads to Indigenous community members not having safe and clean drinking water. It impacts policies that impact society today, where we have housing as a crisis and discrimination against seniors, against people who are poor, and against people who are protected by the Charter, people who are marginalized. I'd like to know, in your own personal life, and also your party's plans, because I'm having a hard time finding it online. I want to know what you're doing to end white supremacy and what your party's plan is for ending white supremacy, if there is even one.
Well, I can tell you that when it comes to indoctrinated racism, I think we need to start looking at our provincial partners, our Indigenous partners, our community partners as real partners, and not as, a marginalized group that can buy into a pipeline or can buy into a certain project because of their ethnicity. When you talk about, stealing, in your words, stealing land for a mining or a mining operation.
Selling off.
Selling off Indigenous lands for a mining operation.
You mentioned about opening up conservation lands, which is a concern that I have. And does that also relate to Indigenous lands as well?
Well, I think that Indigenous groups that have rights to lands need to be treated as true partners, need to be given a piece of any energy or resource distraction that happens on their lands. I don't think that we've seen a federal government that has been inclusive in their approach to provinces that may disagree in the way we get to carbon neutrality or the way we get to a better environment. But I think it starts with just having a very open and inclusive dialogue with people, understanding what their needs are. My comments earlier were not about opening up conservation lands, they were about the amount of lands that conservation authorities own, a small percentage of which being developable, which could be used for community benefit to help the marginalized communities you're talking about.
But my question was, what are you doing in your personal life, and if your party has plans to end white supremacy? It's very key, white supremacy. Because white supremacy impacts policies and continues to do so today.
Well, I'll speak for my personal life. I live a life that is fairly honest and open. I work with, in my history of the province, worked with the Muslim community to ensure that zoning was appropriate or zoning was available for community centers. In my work at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, worked with Indigenous groups to create Indigenous gathering spaces on Conservation Authority land with the University of Toronto. So in my personal life, I have a great deal of experience helping communities to use the resources that are available, that we all own, to find an advantage, to get something built.
Now, the question is about white supremacy. I need to hear those words addressed.
You will not hear those words out of my mouth.
What words?
Thank you for your question.
No, but sorry, what words will I not hear out of your mouth? I'm serious. This is a question. This is a question, period. And this is a very serious issue impacting people in society, including me and including a number of people in this room who recognize the impacts of white supremacy. And so when I'm asking you, are you saying I won't hear what words? I'm wanting to know what words won't I hear out of your mouth?
Those ones.
What are those ones?
White supremacy.
Thank you.
Okay, so are you saying that you are not addressing white supremacy and your party is not addressing white supremacy? Because my concern is, during this election, I've been noticing a lot of Nazi and anti-Semitic sentiments trolling online, and that is part of white supremacy. And your party seems to always welcome Nazis and white supremacists to its party. So if you're saying, and I just want to, it's fair for you to say, you don't want to address white supremacy, I just want to make sure I understand that that is what you're saying, and that you're not involved in any of the trolling online or welcoming white supremacist ideology. I want to know that clearly.
I can tell you very clearly I do not welcome that type of ideology. There is no place for it because I reject the premise of your question.
No.
And I think it is accusatory and I think it is wrong.
I didn't accuse you. I asked a very plain question. And the problem without really knowing that somebody is addressing an issue is the failure of acknowledging the issue. So if you're not wanting to even say white supremacy out of your mouth, I'm questioning whether or not you're actually acknowledging the fundamental issue. And anybody else in this room can get all riled up, but you're the candidate running, and I get to ask you as a constituent in this riding what your role is. Because I can tell you, I've been asking it on social media, and I've been telling people to ask the same question. White supremacy is a federal election issue.
I think you've had or not had your answer. So another question.
I would be remiss if I didn't note that Doug Ford is the elephant in this province. And I think it's clear that Andrew Scheer doesn't want to stand beside Doug Ford. The reason I mentioned Doug Ford is because he is from another, he's from the provincial government, but other candidates have told people in this room that they are willing to work with all levels of government on issues of national importance, and in some cases, issues that cross different boundaries. So in terms of Doug Ford's use of the notwithstanding clause, there were many people, including people in your own party, the Conservative Party, who felt that that should not be used. The federal government does have the ability to override a province that would use notwithstanding clause. My question to you is, in this province, if Doug Ford was to use the notwithstanding clause in an area that the majority of the constituents or the population of this province would feel was wrong, would yourself and or Andrew Scheer be able to stand up to that, or if not, why not?
So I hate to do this, but I will not answer a hypothetical question about what we may do if someone did do something. What I can tell you is that nobody did anything when the notwithstanding clause was used, and it was a federal matter at the time, and the party in government was the Liberal Party. But as for what a Conservative government or I myself might do in the future should another issue like that arise, I think we'd have to leave it to that time.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presence here. I'm really concerned about white supremacy. And I'm really concerned in particular about the immigration hesitancy that has become a sort of cloak for a lot of more serious white supremacy conspiracies, including Islamophobic conspiracies and anti-Semitic. They go hand in hand, which is weird to other people. But what is your party doing to address the really serious conspiracies against Canadian society by white supremacists, white nationalists, immigration hesitant, and frankly the People's Party of Canada?
Well, I can tell you that we let Maxime Bernier out the door to start his own party and do not share any of the values that exist within that party. I can also tell you that today I had a great meeting with the Muslim Association of Canada and discussed a new initiative to work with rental housing providers in the city through the Federation of Rental Housing Providers to help rehome and help stabilize a lot of the new immigrants that are coming into the country. I think that both as a wealthy nation and as a embracing nation, we have a duty to bring people in and help them to become Canadians and help them to really find a home here. What I haven't seen enough of is a transition between federal funded refugees to provincially funded refugees. And I think there need to be better social supports for when people fall off the rolls after a year of funding and fall onto the back of the province. I think we need to work with provinces to ensure that we don't just have a new problem every 12 months, that we have a really integrated social program that helps people transition from federal funding to provincial funding, to finding a job, to starting a family, to becoming a contributing member of our society.
But can you please address what I actually asked, which is, there are conspiracy theories online. They are supported by fringe media, but also not so fringe media, including publications that are widely available in the city, that are promoting lies, complete lies about bringing Sharia law, that Jews are having a conspiracy to bring brown people to replace white people. These are very dangerous, and what is the Conservative Party going to do to address this? It is literally a conspiracy. We sit around typing on the internet about how we're going to actually infiltrate the Conservative Party and have succeeded at some levels.
I'm not sure quite how to answer your question. I can tell you that my wife is Jewish and I have a very multicultural extended family. I'm not sure what conspiracies you're reading, but I don't read them. So
Toronto Sun might help you, but Rebel Media would also run by a Jew. I mean, that's the thing, Jewish people are participating weirdly in these conspiracies because they haven't done the second case.
So I'm going to stop you there. I think you've gone a little bit too far.
There are very serious issues here.
Okay, thank you.
The Conservative plan to fight climate change says that they're going to go after the big polluters. How exactly have you gone, or what exactly would you do to go after the big polluters?
So the tenets of the plan are to go after large polluters, as you say, to ensure that they're either reducing emissions or investing profits in green technology. Where I think we can make the biggest difference are in emerging economies like India and China. We have been a tech leader in the world for the past 50 years, and I think we need to get technology to a place where it is consumable enough, where it is inexpensive enough to be brought to places like India and China to help them green their economy. I think we produce in the realm of 2% of global emissions, and while it is important to do as much as we can at home, we can't sit with our head in the sand and think that if we reduce all of our car travel, that it's going to make a dent in global emissions. We need to work with the largest emitters, we need to help them transition, while also respecting they're going through their own industrial revolution. They're having, the same economic prosperity that we were lucky enough to have 50 years earlier. But it is really about working with massive industry, massive corporation, requiring them to reduce their emissions. And if they don't reduce their emissions, or they don't reduce them enough, requiring them to invest into a technology fund that can help make technology less expensive and more usable around the world.
Thank you, and that was the last question. We've reached the end of Jay's time, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you all for being here, and I know it's been a long evening. I hope you all vote and learn something tonight.
Thanks very much. Remember your glasses.
Pleasure.
Remember your glasses. I got the biggest one.
Stephen, where did you think that there was an accusation? Is it Jay? Sorry. You know why I got confused with Stephen, the minister that you worked with, Mr. Clark? Why did you think there was an accusation with a question is asked directly about white supremacy?
I reject the premise of the question. I don't think that our party propagates it. I don't think
No,
that...
it was a general question, right? It was a general question, so...
In a very combative and accusatory way.
No, why do you think of it as being combative? It was a straightforward question.
I'd rather not.
No, but here's the thing.
No, but
I'm a
seriously,
constituent in this area.
That's
And
wonderful.
you can't, if you're going to act like this now, you're demonstrating who you are as a candidate, that you're not willing to take the issues that we take seriously.
I take you very seriously. I think that I've answered your question very well.
I'm some of us.
There's a whole group of seniors here that would love to talk.
Yeah, and I'm still part of this community. And so when I'm raising a question with you, just now, I just asked you, why did you see it as being confrontational? The question still remains that you're making comments that have no validity to it. I post all my information online, so you can listen back to it and hear yourself in the response and the question. It's not an aggressive question. Perhaps it's not a question you like, but it's a fundamental question that needs to be addressed. And you can't be dismissive of those things. You can't be dismissive of the things that concern your constituents. No, but just saying okay is a very dismissive response.
I need to speak to other constituents. You're taking a lot of people's time.
I'm asking you. I thought I heard you say that you're asking to heard something.
I'm not running.
Well, yeah, but that's why I was confused. No, he's right here. I haven't seen him. He wasn't at the environmental debate. I haven't seen him before, so I'm just asking.
I'll give you my cell phone if you could just let me talk to a few other people, please.
You go right ahead, but don't be dismissive. That's the only point I'm making to you.
With the demographic
You're being disruptive.
shift.
You're interrupting her. Let her speak.
With the demographic shift that's going on now globally, caused by climate change and caused by wars. I'm sorry, you're intimidating me.
How am I intimidating you? By listening to your question?
Just let me speak to this fellow.
Are you saying that nobody else can listen to your question? Is it a private question? Okay, well, you were standing beside me asking it.
Thank you for your
Hi, how are you?
Thank you for your courage and all your tough stance. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think like you asked a lot of questions I wanted to ask, and somehow every time I try to ask a question, it's like this is a time for everyone. So, yeah, I'm sorry, like you keep on getting cut off, and then people call you intimidating.
Well, it's a usual thing that white people say to black people or people of color when they ask a direct question that it's intimidating.
People of color get excused for just simply existing.
Right. So when I say, how is it intimidating, and someone can't give me the answer, then that leads back to what I know to be white supremacist ideology.
Exactly.
So I'm not, I'm an advocate, so I'm not untrained in these experiences. And so I don't easily back down just because somebody else is backing down to fundamental issues impacting our lives.
I'm curious, like Sally and Miss Carolyn Bennett, because I had a dinner appointment.
Yeah.
But were you able to ask her any questions?
No, I didn't get to ask Carolyn questions because I ask Carolyn questions all the time. She's been a member, the MP here for a long time. So I know Carolyn. I can call her, I can send her a message, and I always get a response. So I didn't feel, other than the issue of appealing, dismissing the order that impacts Indigenous community members for the compensation. I did ask her about that in the hallway because the time was up. And she said she doesn't agree with that stance. I said, well, you need to tell your constituents that, because that's what our concerns are, that you're actually dismissing it as a party.
We ask my questions a lot. Like, can I ask you about First Years? Because I have no knowledge of First Years, and I have some friends that are in working with the Indigenous
I don't
communities.
represent Carolyn,
for sure.
so I think the best thing to do is reach out to her team.
Which is gone already.
Okay.
I've been trying to find her team.
I know that. Are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter, yeah.
Okay, so you want to connect with me on Twitter?
Yeah, please.
Because definitely they are on Twitter and they answer questions and all of that. I really like that their team is engaged.
I just found it very helping, like a
Okay, so I am Dion Renee.
Are you a journalist by any chance?
I'm an advocate, so I'll post this on my YouTube channel.
so that anybody who was unable to attend tonight for accessibility concerns are able to still participate hearing what was said.
Thank you. What kind of work do you do?
Advocacy.
But like, what is your
Do you want to
main?
follow me, and then that way you can send me a message, and I can send you a message, and we can stay in touch?
Sure. What do you usually work on? Like, what is your focus?
Sorry for pulling my underwear at my
Sorry.
bottom.
What do you? Yeah. What's your focus?
I just basically say to people very plainly, I make your life better. That's a simple answer. I literally fight for human rights issues, fight against racism and racist practices and white supremacy, ensure accessibility, which is fundamentally key, which is another question I would have wanted to ask, but there was no time. So really, on equity issues.
I am a software developer. Nice. I have a focus on web accessibility.
Awesome.
So if you can think of anything that we can work together, I will send you a
What's
message.
Your name, love?
I'm Joy.
Joy, nice to meet you. So I'm going to look now because we're connected on Twitter.
Yes, and I will send you a message, and because I really want to do some work, especially on increasing the lives for Indigenous peoples, because my partner, he works up north, and he sees a lot of the struggles of Indigenous youth. Like there's a high school girl, she had to leave her home and her family to go to high school in Sluka, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and then she's a transgender child, and her parents are suffering from substance abuse. She has no access to, very limited access, very limited access to mental health services. So I want to make lives better for kids like her.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. And did you want to ask Jay a question?
I actually want to ask him about Indigenous issues.
Am I allowed to listen?
Yes, you are.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. How are you? My name is Joy.
Joy, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I have a question about Indigenous issues. I am wearing a t-shirt and it's a Wake a Giant movement. Have you heard of the Wake a Giant movement? So it's a movement in Thunder Bay, and it's focused on making the lives of the Indigenous children better. Thunder Bay is a place where a lot of Indigenous children leave their home, their family, and friends to attend high school because there's no education provided on reserve, and they experience a lot of emotional trauma, a lot of substance abuse, a lot of discrimination, which brings me back to the conversation about white supremacy, which I actually believe is an issue, maybe contrary to your own beliefs. And there are many children like her. There's another child, she's in high school and she's transgender and her parents are suffering from substance abuse and she has very limited access to mental health and a lot of her friends have committed suicide. So my question is, what are you and your party planning to do to make the lives for her and her friends better?
So I think the best things we can do for Indigenous communities, what we haven't done for Indigenous communities as a federal government, is treat Indigenous communities like partners and share in the prosperity of the resource development and the extraction that's happened on treaty lands and on other lands. I think it would be important, and I don't think I can tell you this is not the party's position, but this is mine. I think it's very important that if we're creating, if we're nationalizing pipelines, if we're creating a national energy corridor, that the communities that are impacted, whether they're provincial or Indigenous, are actually receiving a piece of the profit margin, are actually getting some of the economic prosperity that's generated by it.
Do the Indigenous community have a say about what kind of projects happen on their lands? Do they have their own land sovereignty? Is there going to be a nation-to-nation?
They don't right now. They don't have land sovereignty. They don't own land sovereignty. I can tell you my personal opinion is that land should be owned. It shouldn't just be licensed and still owned by the crown.
The land ownership.
My personal opinion.
Yeah,
absolutely.
the land ownership concept is a very colonial concept, and it was
ridiculous.
it was never really recognized by the Indigenous communities. And is there going to be a nation-to-nation conversation happening? Like if we were to have a minority conservative government, would you personally support a nation-to-nation conversation about land sovereignty and land ownership?
Regardless of the type of government, minority or majority, I would absolutely support that conversation.
Land sovereignty?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Did you have a question, sister?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm just here to compliment the people that did well.
Aw, you're so kind. Brother, do you have a question?
Okay. Wonderful.
What was that?
Thank you, guys.
Oh. Let me stop this. The end of the Christie Gardens Forum for Toronto St. Paul's.